Thanks so much for inviting us to be here, and welcome everyone to this fireside chat on environmental challenges reshaping economic growth, which are a lot of buzzwords that comprise all of my favorite topics and kind of, I think, the life's work of all the people that we're lucky enough to have on this panel. So we have kind of a few stages we'll go through in this hour. First, we'll just introduce ourselves, and then we'll give everybody on the panel a directed question that people can use to talk about kind of some of their own interests and their own work and how that relates to the topic. And then we'll have a group discussion around some guided questions, and then we'll open up the discussion to the audience. So I guess we'll start by introducing ourselves. And since I'm already talking, I'll go first. I'm Ishan. I'm currently an economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. It's very important to note that I do not in any way speak for the Fed. I'm just a junior researcher doing my own work, and I'm soon leaving for an academic position, and that will even more guarantee that I don't speak for the Fed. And yeah, now others can introduce themselves. Maybe we can have next, we have Professor Stephanie Pincetl from UCLA's Institute of Climate and Sustainability.
Hi, yeah. Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. I am trained as an urban planner, actually, but in the past decade, I've been working on a lot on energy infrastructure systems and water systems. And I've been very, very interested all my life in the question of the human relationship to the environment and how we shape the environments that we live in and resource our fairly extravagant lifestyles in general from those natural resources. So I'm very happy to be here, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Great. Maybe next we can have, we have Smitha Brunemeyer here, who's the Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of Economics at Princeton.
Hi, I am Smitha. I'm trained as an economist as well, and have been studying environmental regulations, I guess now for the past 3 decades, and have been interested in questions like both the costs of regulations and the benefits of them, and have participated in the writing of some of the regulations under the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and the Toxic Substance Control Act. And the questions I'm specifically interested in are firm responses to these regulations. Do they innovate? Some firms tend to overcomply. Some tend to shirk their responsibilities and relocate to other countries. So trying to disentangle the incentives of firms is particularly interesting to me. And I look forward to this conversation as well.
Great, thanks. Next, we have Ken Alex, who's the Director of Project Climate at the UC Berkeley Center for Law, Energy, and Environment, and was previously the Senior Policy Advisor to Governor Jerry Brown, and also many other positions that are listed in the bio.
Thanks, Ishan. You pretty much got my my bio. I'm a lawyer by training. I spent 25 years in the California Attorney General's office. I was the head of the environment section and did a fair amount of the first wave of climate litigation, including a case that went to the Supreme Court called AEP versus Connecticut. And at the governor's office was really focused on how California, as now the 5th largest economy in the world, if it was its own country, how it can move the economy forward while reaching very serious and hopefully meetable climate goals, and trying to continue that work here at UC Berkeley, focusing on how we move climate solutions more quickly to policy and scale, really trying to dig into the implementation issues at the subnational level, both in the US and internationally. Also very pleased to be here. Thanks very much.
Awesome. And then finally, we have Professor Klaus Desmet from Southern Methodist University, who's also a research fellow at the Center on Economic Policy Research and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. And I'm lucky that Klaus is the only person on the panel I regularly get to see at conferences because we work on similar topics, including international trade and macroeconomics related to climate change.
Yeah, well, nice to see you, Ishan, and nice to see everyone else on the panel here. I've been working on climate change and global warming for a while now, and in particular, I'm interested in trying to understand how climate change will reshape the economic geography of the world, essentially trying to understand how it will affect where people want to live and work. You know, you can think of issues, for example, related to climate-induced migration, issues related to what types of sectors and activities different places might want to specialize in, because the basic fact, I guess, of global warming is that it will affect different places very differently, and because of that, we would expect, you know, the sort of spatial distribution of the economy and populations to change, both at a global level and more locally, say in the US or in other countries.
Thanks. Yeah, so we have a great group of people, obviously, on the panel. Thanks so much to the organizers for putting all of us together. And so now we have some guided questions that I think people can answer one at a time before we move into the group discussion. It's kind of interesting. We have a mix of people who focus on more micro and local and state policy issues, and then some people who focus more on kind of the more macro and international and global. So maybe we'll start and build up micro to macro a little bit on the panel. And so I guess to start with, it'd be great if Professor Pincetl can tell us a little bit about some of the details of her work, and especially how it affects land use challenges in California and how those intersect with the challenges of wildfires and some of the implications for local communities of the increasing challenges that we're facing, both from wildfires and I think also you said you work on water issues. So it'd be great if you could tell us some about that to start us off.
Is that all you want to know?
I know this. I know we can each talk on each of these topics for a long time, but
right. So it's very interesting to hear people talk about climate change as a thing that affects us, whereas I tend to think of climate change as something produced by our activities that then affect us. And so the question is, for me, how do we better think about living in the places we actually do live in, rather than think prospectively about where we might want to move? Because there's really no place to move that will not be affected in some way or another by climate change. And so that, for me, boils down often to the question of land use. How do we plan how do we plan our cities? How do we allow developments to take place in some places and not in other places? How do we decide what density is appropriate and who lives where? Because local governments decide much of that disposition on the land. And that disposition on the land can enhance or mitigate impacts on people when there are experiences of, say, wildfire. And we also must remember that we use the term wildfire, but in California, at least, most of those wildfires are human-induced. They are caused by people making mistakes, people doing things in a sloppy way, and or transmission infrastructure for electricity that is either poorly maintained or there's some kind of shock to the system. And so it's we have to think of this in a more circular kind of way and not a one-directional approach. So for me, if we continue to build outward in cities, cities continue to build outward, we are simply increasing people's exposure to the possibility of a wildfire, or actually of more severe drought impacts. If we concentrate our infrastructure and we live in more dense urban environments, the likelihood of those accidents of nature and humans are lessened. The problem really is that we are very attached in the United States to a sprawled land use, and that we consider the ability to own a house in a suburb with our cars as a of symbols of our liberty in the United States and of living well. And so to kind of think about how to shift people's perception of well-being is really a big challenge for us, because those are highly energy intensive lifestyles, they're highly resource intensive lifestyles, they're highly land use intensive lifestyles, and they're highly vulnerable lifestyles. And so I think that for us to be able to think about climate mitigation, or strategies to mitigate the increase in greenhouse gas emissions, because we already have a lot in the atmosphere, we have to confront the fact that we have habits that have been ingrained over a century that are habits, and habits can change, but how do we instill the understanding that not only we can change habits, but also that we'll still live pretty well with different kinds of habits. These are expectations that are ideological. They're not factual. They're about ideas about how you live well. So for me, those are the kinds of questions that I think face us relative to climate, economic activity, and the rest, and that they're really, really hard to address. So I'm going to stop there and allow the next person to express their feelings about these things.
Thank you for that fascinating overview. I think there was lots of content in there that will be fruitful for the discussion. I'm sure that people have lots of thoughts on lots of the interesting things that you raised. And certainly some of your thoughts about urbanization and population movements intersect with some of Klaus's research. But to prevent us from getting too deep into the discussion, I'm going to switch gears a little, and maybe we can go to Ken next. The question that we have for you here, but you can also talk about a different topic if you prefer, is based on your experience working in a very important policy role during the California energy crisis. I wonder if you have any particular thoughts and insights into how energy reliability and supply and prices intersect with kind of the important climate policies that we're now trying to implement to change the grid over to lower carbon energy.
So I think most of our audience probably has no idea about what the California energy crisis was, since it was in 2001 and 2, or 2000 and 2001. So I think I'll talk a little bit differently. I want to, it's related, but I want to talk about the fact that we are not really thinking about, well, I think we're maybe thinking about it, but we're not talking much about the economic impact on individuals of the climate crisis. And I think that failure has led to the failure of us to talk about climate in elections. And so I think the climate has acute impacts like the LA fires, like the hurricanes in Florida, that we're not capturing fully as inflationary, as individual impacts, as impacts on cities. And that failure means that when we talk about economics and inflation and the current set of economies, we're not really capturing climate change in its immediacy. So the upheaval of lives and community at Los Angeles is a perfect example of this. There's huge response costs. There's rebuilding costs. There's costs to people's communities. You think about having to rebuild schools, grocery stores, churches, et cetera, the time that it's impacting of people. But because it's acute, it only affects people primarily in Los Angeles. It has reverberations outside of that as well. But we have to think about it differently and California and Florida are sort of the leading edge of some of the insurance crisis that people are facing that are going to be profoundly impactful. If you can't insure your house, then you increase your individual risk dramatically. And if you can't get insurance, you might not be able to get a mortgage to buy a house. And so these are, the cost of insurance is going up, the availability of insurance is going up, and it dovetails to a certain extent with what Stephanie was talking about, because we want to build houses in what is sometimes called the WUI, the wildland urban interface. And those have insurance costs and very direct impacts on individuals. Climate change is affecting individual products, food supply. It's going to have a very big impact on things that people want, like coffee and chocolate and almonds. There's increased invasive species. There's impacts on with drought and flooding on cost of food and on the food supply and on the food system. The pandemic was kind of a leading edge of what can happen to the food supply. In terms of electricity issues, I'll just mention a few and then wrap up. But wildfire has a real impact on transmission lines and can very much disrupt electricity, and vice versa. So right now in California, when it gets hot in the summer, because of the threat of wildfire, the utility companies actually do rolling blackouts and shut off areas that have the potential to cause fires from their transmission lines. The transmission cost of building the new transmission we need is enormous. There's issues around energy storage and the impacts of that, and the use of artificial intelligence. We can go on and on about the impacts of climate change in a pretty immediate way. And I think we need to get used to talking about that so that the argument is not always, it costs more to build ourselves into a place that is resilient. It is actually far more expensive not to. So, Ishan, I'll stop there and look forward to kind of having an interaction on some of these issues.
Thanks. Yeah, definitely lots more fruitful thoughts for discussion. I guess I'll go to Smitha next. And the question that was suggested for you is based on your work about how policy and regulations can affect innovation. I wonder if you have any thoughts on how policies and regulatory incentives might be affecting the types of land management and development practices that affect, for example, the costs of the California wildfires. But also, if you'd prefer to tell us about a different topic, that's fine too.
I guess I can lead from where Professor Pincetl and Alex talked about the causes of the wildfires and some of the impacts. And so one thing to note was that a lot of the wildfire causes are because of things that are happening at the local level, decisions being made at the state level, the national level, and the global level. And so at the local level, they talked about how the wildland urban interface is expanding. So about 12 or 13% of California's population lives like right next to wildlands. And so increasing the exposure. But you also have like federal forest management policies that for the last century have prevented the manual thinning down of understory and underbrush in forests, and they haven't been controlled prescribed burns. So you just have much more fuel for those fires to spread. And most importantly, at least from my perspective, is like the root cause might be like climate change and global warming, which is making the temperatures rise, and you have much more drought. So you have more fuel, you have like people living closer to forests, and you have like more conditions in the weather where a fire can start and then spread, right? And so what can we do about it? So one thing to think about is that like about 58% of the forests in California are actually owned by the federal government. So local governments don't have much say, except to say that people can't live like close to those lands. About 40% of those forests are owned privately. Some of it is like timber farms, but a lot of it is like families, the tribes that own those forests. And only about 3% of those forests are actually owned by state governments. So there's room for local governments to do things. You've talked about like different land use planning decisions. There could be zoning laws. There could be restrictions on like planning codes, which prevent future development to be so close to the wildlands. You could also have different forest management practices, which actually have like prescribed controlled burns of these forests to reduce the amount of fuel that will catch fire in the next next year. This is happening regularly every year. But there's also a lot of role for technology and innovation, and private firms are stepping up using things like remote sensing and robots to collect like data. And so the things like Fireside, the federal governments like NASA had like satellites out there, but they're not really real time. So they collect the maps and release that images like a couple of times a day. But now you have like Google sending out a constellation of satellites with EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund. You have like private firms which are like sending out satellites like Fireside, which will basically give you real-time information at a very small, like high-resolution area. So you can figure out that there's a fire like much faster and respond much faster, right? And there are also things like Lockheed Martin owns like Black Hawk helicopters that they're modifying to help like have like autonomous helicopters that help with firefighting. And you have robots and private firms coming up with inventions like burn bots that can go and help like control these fires, right? So there's lots of like scope for innovation and new modern technologies to help like reduce the damage from the risk, right? But that's also all ex post. So the ex ante thing needs to be to reduce the causes of the fires to begin with, which is one, like put less population and property close to like the forest, and the second is address climate change, and that's like the most important thing. And so lots of options for addressing climate change, they fall on, and we can learn from our environmental regulation history of like, we have a long history of trying to combat things like SO2, of nitrogen emission reductions, particulate matter emission reductions, toxic substance control. And so essentially the kinds of policies we've used have been of two broad categories. One is command and control, which is more prescriptive. And the other is market-based incentive schemes, which are less prescriptive. They basically tell like firms what the end goal is going to be, but the compliance mechanism is like left for firms to decide. And so my research has like looked and compared like, what's the result of these different types of regulations. And so for command and control regulations would be more like you're prescribing the quantity or the end result, right? That this is the amount of pollution I want at the end of the day. That gives us some certainty on actually reaching the pollution target. But the problem is that those might be much more costly. And another problem from an innovation perspective is that it might lead to lock-in of an existing technology, right? In contrast, like we have things like market-based incentive schemes, which would just either specify a price or the quantity of the pollution, and then let firms do their own thing and figure out what's the best compliance strategy. And those seem to work a bit better in trying to motivate innovation. So I've looked at innovations in the US manufacturing sector from the 80s and 90s and find that these more flexible schemes lead to more invention of green technology. You also have regulatory pressure, not domestically, because here we've been following the political cycle. One party comes in, sets regulations which are stringent, the next comes 4 years later, removes them. But you have much more consistent pressure coming from other countries, especially Europe. And so we find that even firms in the United States are adapting and innovating to reach these other markets. Okay, and so that was there are more recent papers, there's one by Aberg in 2023, which is saying specifically for California, they have a cap and trade program of their own that has promoted green invention. One of my students is currently looking at venture capital financing in the green industry. And again, the impact of once you put the cap and trade program in California in place, what's happening to it. So he has about 25 years of data where we have maybe 11,000 projects that are being financed by the private sector, by venture capitalists looking at green tech. And so there's lots of like opportunities out there. Of course, in the discussion section, we can talk about like, oh, how as the federal policy like keeps changing, the signals and the financial incentives are changing. But like if there is like at the state level or the private industry level or the NGO level, like some incentivization going on, firms will respond and technology responds. Okay.
Great, thanks. All right, I think I'll go next. I'll pose a question to myself and answer it quickly, and so we can get to Klaus, which I think will segue well into a good discussion among some of the perhaps differing views of panelists on certain topics that might be interesting to get into. So I guess in my research focuses a lot, we've been talking about the impacts of climate change on especially which parts of the world are most vulnerable to the impacts of global warming. And so I'll just quickly highlight kind of an unfortunate trilemma of the research on the impacts of climate change, which in economics, we've been trying to build up using like lots and lots of data from different events around the world to see what sorts of events are, what severe weather events, extreme temperatures, droughts, floods, things like that, what sorts of populations are harmed and sectors of the economy and how harmed they are. And there's kind of this unfortunate coincidence where the three determinants of who in the world is most vulnerable to climate events and global warming turns out to be all three determinants are the same group of people. And so one thing we know is that it's much worse for productivity if you work on a farm than if you work in an office or a factory. Obviously, agriculture is directly weather vulnerable. And so we can see really clearly in the data that the impact of a drought or a severely hot day is about 10 times larger for a farm than for another sector of the economy. And then the second thing we can see is whether you work at a farm or on a factory or in an office, you're a lot more vulnerable if you're in a lower income country. So farms in the United States with better technology and more heat resistant seeds and things like that are a lot less vulnerable than farms in developing countries to the same type of extreme heat event or drought. And similarly, factories in the United States and offices in the United States and richer countries tend to have more protections, things like air conditioning and other things that we can afford in richer countries. So if you work on a farm, it's still better to be in a rich country. If you work on an office, it's still better to be in a rich country in terms of the impacts of climate change on productivity. And then the third thing we know is whether you work in a factory or on a farm, you're much more vulnerable if you're in a place that's already hot. And so it really doesn't matter that much. We can see in the data if you move a 65-degree day to a 75-degree day, but it's really quite harmful to move a 90-degree day to a 100-degree day. And so what we know from the evidence is that you're really vulnerable if you're a farmer relative to a non-farmer. You're really vulnerable if you're in a low-income country relative to a high-income country, and you're really vulnerable if you're in a hot place relative to a not so hot place. And we have this like really unfortunate coincidence where all the farmers and all the hot places and all the low-income countries are all in the same places. The employment share in agriculture is very high in very hot, poor countries. So we kind of have this unfortunate situation where the impacts of global warming are like very highly concentrated on certain populations in the world. And I'll maybe use that to tee up what Klaus wants to say about his own work, about how adaptation to climate change can take place both within place and across regions, and how both cities and urban planning and also kind of global economic geography is affecting the impacts of climate change.
Yeah, so great. Precisely sort of following up on what Ishan was mentioning and talking about, it's very obvious that in some sense, spatial inequality will increase a lot due to global warming. Everyone is affected, but some places much more than others. And of course, some places may even gain, right? I mean, if your starting temperature is very low and you get a couple of degrees of warming, that may actually be a net benefit. And because different places are affected so differently, we would actually expect on a sort of a broad level, we would expect people to move from places that are more negatively affected to places that are either less affected or maybe even positively affected. And on the one hand, there's nothing really revolutionary about that insight. If you go back, say, to the 1930s Dust Bowl in the US, we had close to 3 million people moving out of the Great Plains, Oklahoma and other states to California and to the West. So that has happened throughout history. And in fact, more recent research does show that, people take into account anticipation of future climate shocks in their decisions of where they want to live. Firms take into account these potential future shocks in their decisions of where they want to locate, etc. Now, of course, on the other hand, some people will tell you, I don't really see much happening in terms of migration and population movements. Say in the US, people have been moving for decades from the so-called snow belt to the sun belt. People have been moving to Florida, and it so seems that people are actually moving increasingly to warmer places. But of course, we need to be careful when we make these kind of statements and when we do this type of analysis. The right question is not really, are people moving to this place or to the other, but rather, what would these movements look like in the absence of climate change? So there's, of course, many reasons why people in the US are moving to the Sun Belt. It may be because of cheaper housing. It may be because of lower taxes and regulation, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, some recent research coming out of the San Francisco Fed shows that in the absence of climate change, even more people would be moving to the Sun Belt, right? And so when you make the comparison, in fact, the fact that the world is warming is somewhat slowing down that movement to the Sun Belt, which in some sense indirectly is telling you that people take into account climate change and future climate change in their decisions of where they want to live. Now, if you go back, say, to the case of California and the California wildfires, etc., and so someone could ask the question, okay, so do you expect people to be moving out of Pacific Palisades and all these other places and move somewhere else where they're going to be much less vulnerable? That's, of course, not obvious, right? Because there's many, many reasons why people want to be in a place. Maybe that area is beautiful. Maybe because it's close to LA, or actually part of LA that has access to highly productive jobs, etc. So there's many, many reasons why people live in the place where they do live. And climate change is just one of the many determinants of where people might want to live. And so when you look at it from that point of view, we obviously don't want to make the statement of saying, well, all migration patterns will now suddenly be explained by whatever happens to the climate. But that said, the fact that some places are more affected and other places are less affected, there is some room for adaptation to global warming by having people move across space, in the same way as Ishan was saying that people might also change their specialization. If I live in a place where it becomes too hot to farm, or if I live in a place where the temperatures are too high to grow grapes to produce wine, well, either I need to move into some other type of activity, or maybe I will start growing wine in more northern latitudes, etc. And all these types of adaptations are gradually occurring. And I think the importance is that a lot of these things are extremely gradual, right? So they may not be something that we notice over a period of a few years. We may not even notice it over a decade. But if we take a long view, we know that we're moving in a particular direction in terms of warming, that will over time, maybe over decades, even centuries, it will to some extent reshape the economic geography of the world. So let me just stop here.
So I think now we should open up for some general discussion. I think there were lots of interesting topics that came up when everyone was giving their answers. So I don't know if someone has like a particular thing that you heard someone else say that you want to react to, or something that you'd want to elaborate on. But I think maybe it would be interesting to stick on this topic, especially since, you know, the wildfires in California were part of how we got to this discussion of how kind of like the economic development and land use policies can shape adaptation to climate change. And so maybe we want to stick on that topic for a couple of minutes. Stephanie, I feel like you were saying some really interesting things in your conversation about how these topics interact. I wonder if you have some more thoughts.
Well, I think that the looming question is really the one that Ken raised, and that is insurability. And not only actually for the individual who wishes to be insured in a high fire area, but also what it does to insurance markets across the country, which I'm not an insurance expert, but I do think that these are not independent, right? And so one of the questions I think that's important there are two aspects to this. One is whether people will rebuild because they may not be able to due to the cost of insurance, only the wealthy will, or they'll self-insure. But also, what are as others have alluded to, the societal impacts of people's risk, right? So it's not simply my risk, but it's also the pool's risk. And that applies beyond that. So in our case here, rebuilding in the fire-prone areas of the Palisades where very wealthy people live, or in Altadena where there were much less affluent people lived, who pays for the rebuilding ultimately? So if you're rebuilding the gas infrastructure, the ratepayers are going to be assuming that cost. If you're repaying the electricity infrastructure, the ratepayers are going to be paying that cost. And this is not, and what's an interesting aspect of that, I think, is that there's not much discussion generally among those who will end up paying at least part of it about whether they should be allowed to rebuild in those places, because the socialization of the costs is significant, right? And so, and excuse me for a moment here, the Pacific Palisades are now absolutely resisting even the thought of having affordable housing built alongside rebuilding, the very expensive homes that will be rebuilt. And you wonder, well, here we are, the rest of LA paying for your rebuilt infrastructure, and you don't want to accept the idea that you might have like 10% affordable housing there of the people who actually service all your houses. So it raises a lot of questions about who bears the cost, as Klaus was talking about actually, and who gets the benefit, right? And so I think there are lots of questions there that are very difficult to talk about because people see things in a very boxed off way. But I see Ken's going to weigh in on this, and I really am happy to hear what he has to say.
Well, I think in some ways it's even worse, because if you think about New Orleans, in the real life world, we should not have rebuilt New Orleans, because what happened there is going to happen again. And you could say the same thing about the Paradise Fire in California from a few years ago. It's a repeating incident. And then we can say in the Palisades in Los Angeles that if you build back again, and people are going to be given the opportunity, basically without red tape, amazingly enough, to rebuild 110% of their previous footprint, in locations that already did not have very good emergency access in and out, putting people's lives at risk should the fires happen again, because you can't get emergency vehicles in and you can't get people out in a timely way. So really sort of underscoring Stephanie's point, we're understandably, we want to get people back in their houses. And of course, people in the Palisades, as Stephanie said, are very affluent, and they have the ability to influence the political process. But it's not the best kinds of ways to make decisions. And so there's even another situation in California where people can't get insurance. There's something called the FAIR Plan, which is funded initially by insurance companies and reinsurers, but at a certain point, which will probably be triggered in Los Angeles, every other homeowner who has an insurance policy in California in a fire-prone area or not gets a surcharge to cover that cost. So as Stephanie points out, there are many ways in which Californians and ratepayers are paying for some of the rebuild in California. I'll stop there because it is a certain aggravation.
So the FAIR Plan part made sense to me, but could you elaborate a little more on the other ways in which the costs of rebuilding the Palisades are being socialized? I guess I didn't realize.
Yeah, so what Stephanie said is exactly right. The cost of rebuilding, whether it's a natural gas delivery system or an electricity delivery system, that's paid for by ratepayers because that's put into rate base. And actually the utility gets a rate of return on that infrastructure, so it'll be more expensive than the existing system.
And Stephanie, what exactly was the affordable housing policy that was rejected? What was the proposal?
Well, in California, you probably know, like lots of places that are, desirable, the affordability of real estate is very high. It's very hard to afford real estate. And so California has tried to affect that by requiring, or the city is, it's a very complicated terrain, but the idea is when you're going to be rebuilding, especially if you build apartment buildings, you should set aside a certain proportion of affordable housing or housing for low-income people. And the perception that has been longstanding in the United States is if you have apartment buildings with affordable housing, you're going to get crackheads and robbers and black people and, all those undesirables. And that rhetoric has been voiced in the case of the Palisades, saying we do not want any affordable housing up here. And in fact, we will think of seceding from the city of Los Angeles if you try to impose any extra density on us or any affordable housing on us. So they're happy to benefit from the ratepayers subsidizing their electricity being restored, their water being restored, their roads being fixed, and so on. But don't ask us to share in any of the other necessities of the city, like more dense housing or more affordable housing.
Separate question that I have that I wonder if anyone knows the answer to, and also people can just chime in with whatever thoughts they have. But is the Palisades actually is that area actually more wildfire risk than other parts of Los Angeles in the long run? Because I feel like in the background lurking here is the idea that maybe we just don't rebuild it. But also, obviously, if we just leave a whole chunk of Los Angeles unbuilt, that's going to increase real estate prices and decrease supply even more. And my understanding of the map, I have several close friends who live in near areas nearby UCLA, including some whose houses burned down. My understanding is that of the map is kind of that, actually it's pretty surprising that the fires got all the way to where they got to, because it's pretty far from some of the densely wooded areas. So is there any kind of evidence on whether this area was actually ex ante high risk or just happened to be the place that burned down?
Well, I will say this. The insurance companies had started to charge far more or threatened to withdraw from some of those parts of Los Angeles already. The Malibu Palisades area has burned multiple times. In fact, Mike Davis's book, The Ecology of Fear, in one of his chapters is Let Malibu Burn. It's been rebuilt, I don't know, half a dozen times, Ken, at least. People know very well that this is a very, very high fire prone area. And it's not wooded, by the way. This is not a place where there are forests. This is a place of California chaparral and oak woodland. It's a completely different fire regime than the Sierra Nevada or other forested areas. And so not only do we not understand the ecology of the place and its fire regime, but we also refuse to accept that these areas have burned multiple times and will burn again. There's no preventing the burning, period, with the Santa
So is the
Ana
idea
winds.
that we would just not rebuild it at all? And if so, what proportion of Los Angeles would meet this criteria? Like the insurance companies have been pulling out of large swaths of the state, right? So like,
Yeah.
how much of Los Angeles should we pull out of by that criteria?
I can't give you that number, but I will say that at about in the 20s, the Olmsted brothers, who are the sons of Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed Central Park, had developed a big open space and landscape plan on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce of Los Angeles. And in that plan, they advocated for the preservation of most of the Santa Monica Mountains. And other places. The real estate industry in the state of California and in Los Angeles had that report basically withdrawn and smothered because the prospect of not building as much as they possibly could everywhere was anathema to their way of thinking. So what do we build? We build extensive suburbs. There's plenty of room to build in LA, excuse me. It's just, we don't want to live that way. So what gives? I don't want to be paying for those guys for fire protection anymore. I'm tired of it. It's my money. I don't have a choice.
I think this is actually a very, very interesting conversation. I mean, as you said, Ishan, I mean, the big question is, can people go elsewhere? And if they can, then there doesn't seem to be really a need to be socializing all these costs. And there should just be some type of regulation that restricts building in such areas. I mean, I'll give you the example of, say, the Netherlands, right? The Netherlands is a country which is mostly below sea level. It's extremely densely populated. And because of that, there's obviously a high flood risk. And people don't, because most, a big chunk of the country is below sea level, people can't really avoid being below sea level. If you live in the Netherlands, it's not such a big country. And because of that, they obviously have all kinds of dikes and systems to protect themselves against flooding. And they also have a high degree of government paid insurance, where they socialize a risk that affects almost everyone. But of course, the U.S. has one advantage when you think about climate change. It's a big country. There's no reason necessarily that we should live in very vulnerable places, and if we choose to do so, then maybe it would be a good idea to try to avoid socializing that risk. But it's also very difficult to do. I mean, until recently, economists used to sort of think that most of the socialization of the risk happens through governments, right? Who sort of after a disaster have a hard time saying, well, you know what, I'm not going to help you. That's not what a government is supposed to do at a moment of difficulty. And so they're sort of forced into helping. But what we're hearing, and what is very interesting to me, is that part of the socialization is also happening through through the private sector, right? So if insurance companies are raising their premiums, maybe not just in California, but across the entire United States, there's people who are not living in particularly vulnerable areas who are also seeing their insurance premiums go up, because these are large companies, and these are companies that operate across the entire country. And so there is an element of unfairness there, where it is a big country, people could move elsewhere, and we're making everyone else pay the cost. But I don't see, but it's hard to find a very practical solution to it, except maybe what some of you have mentioned, which is when a disaster strikes, somehow find ways of restricting people from rebuilding in particular areas, conditional on there being other areas close by available, right, that don't have the risk. And that's why I think Ishan's question is a very interesting one. Which percentage of Metro LA is kind of in that situation? Because of course it is a very productive place. It has lots of problems with housing affordability, and so that makes the question particularly difficult and interesting at the same time.
Well, there's a famous book by John McPhee called The Control of Nature. And one of the chapters, there's 3 examples. One's about the Mississippi River, and that river will go where it will go. But one of the examples is the canyons of Los Angeles that are going to continue to basically fall. So there's a lot of places in Los Angeles that are quite vulnerable that should not have been built. And as you say, it's almost impossible to stop it and to stop rebuilding when disasters occur. And it may be that in uninsurability will change some of that, but I suspect that's going to be very difficult to have happen. One thing that is happening is and this is true all over the country, including in places like Florida, but there are new flood maps and new fire hazard maps. Right now, we do flood insurance in a way that allows people to build in floodplains, which is problematic. So there needs to be some rethinking of areas to preserve and areas to allow building and to change our sense of what density we want to allow and promote.
So I just wanted to tack on one comment about that, and then ask a more general question. We don't have to build the same way either, right? And so, in my mind's eye, one fantastic idea would be, if we're rebuilding in the Palisades, why don't we build little villages, right, that are defensible, instead of miles and miles and acres and thousands of acres of houses. If you compacted the buildings, you could have better defensible space, right? So it's not all or nothing, but that middle path is a very hard one for people to get their heads around. But what I wanted to ask my economist friends here on this panel is about this idea that people can migrate. And I think that what we see globally today is a lot of walls going up relative to climate refugees. And the climate refugees are also economic refugees because it goes hand in hand. And then there are all kinds of other issues going on. So I was just curious about that. I felt that the discussion was maybe a little facile, right? Oh, people will move. Maybe people can't move. And so what then?
Yeah, so Stephanie, I think this is, of course, a very important question. And I would say a few things. In any serious study, one has to incorporate the actual cost of moving that we observe. And there are enormous frictions to moving. I think you're absolutely right. And so that limits the adaptation through migration. What might save it a little bit is the idea that some of the effects of climate change are extremely gradual and play out over decades. And of course, when you take a view of, say, 40, 50, 60, 100 years, there are gradual changes in where people live across the globe. For example, if you look 50, 60 years ago, there were probably not that many immigrants living in Europe. Now it's probably close to 15% in most countries. So it would be much higher if there were free migration. And so there are, I agree with you, there's enormous frictions, but there are some small movements. And the question is, to what extent will those small movements be responsive to climate change? So that's one thing. Another thing is that there's also the possibility, of course, of seeing some of these movements within countries, right? And so, again, if you think about the population distribution within the US, it is actually quite different from what it was 50, 60, 70 years ago. There's many more people living in the South. There's more people living in Florida. There's more people living in percentage terms, at least in California. There's less people living in the Northeast, etc. And so there is some room for reshaping that geography within countries. Across countries, it's much more limited, and that's why maybe I gave you the example of the Netherlands, right? In the Netherlands, because they are facing climate risk in essentially their entire territory. I agree with you. You can't just say, "Oh, let the Dutch just move out." Europe is a big place; they can go wherever they want to. And because that is difficult, and because it is costly, the Dutch government will obviously take the path of saying, "No, I need to find ways of protecting the land," and they very heavily invest in protection infrastructure. Whereas maybe, as Ken said, if it is coastal Louisiana and you think that the US is a big country, it's a valid question to ask: to what extent do we want to protect coastal Louisiana? To what extent do we want to rebuild or not rebuild parts of New Orleans? I think that's a reasonable question to ask. It's much less reasonable to ask if it were Amsterdam, right? And so I definitely don't want to give the impression that we're thinking of a nice, beautiful world where people just go wherever they want to. That's very far from reality. And therefore, when we try to make projections, they need to be based on actual migration frictions. And they are very high, especially across countries.
Just to add a little bit to what Klaus was saying, which I agree with, it's we're trying to just take how much can people migrate straight from the data of how much people do migrate. And obviously, climate change will change a lot of things, but a good starting point for thinking about how possible is it to migrate is just looking at what are people doing now. And there's a couple of key facts that we see in that data. One is that people move to the extent that they move within countries for the most part, but even that has been like rapidly declining over the last few decades in the United States. Like people are becoming a lot less mobile. And I think you guys have touched on a lot of the institutional and policy reasons that might play along with that. And then the second fact is that to the extent that people move across countries, unfortunately, we have very, very little of the most valuable type of climate migration, which is people moving from very low income countries to middle and higher income countries. There's There's a great report by the Center of Global Development that just kind of aggregates the international migration data from throughout the world. And what you basically see is that movements from low income to high income countries are like a rounding error on the global population. It's like very few people. And most of the movements that do happen internationally tend to be to neighboring countries and countries of a similar income level. But even within that, there still could be some scope for changes that reduce and affect how vulnerable people are to climate impacts. I think it's worth highlighting that even at kind of a regional level, there can be a lot of differences in how vulnerable places are. Like, for example, in East Africa, there's some countries that have like quite high altitudes that aren't as hot, like parts of Uganda and parts of Kenya and parts of Rwanda. And so some of our research has shown that there can be places that are neighboring countries that are like surprisingly not super vulnerable, even when some of their neighbors are some of the most vulnerable places in the world. But we definitely take the point that, there's kind of the ideal in the economist's mind. The ideal is that we would have lots of the most valuable migration, but we're very, very far away from that ideal. And I think that's important to point out. So I'm not sure exactly. Also, please ignore the 2-year-olds crying in the background. I'm not sure how much longer we're supposed to go on, but I guess I have one more topic that I was interested in getting people's views on that kind of comes from one of the suggested questions. And I've been tracking the questions in the chat as well. And I think we've been hitting on a lot of those topics in our discussion. So in the suggested questions, there's a question about how we anticipate the new presidency affecting the climate policy and things like that. But I want to ask a slightly different version of that question, which is I wonder whether people have thoughts on how the current politics of climate and energy in the United States affect how it's most effective to pitch and to discuss climate policies, and whether some of what we've experienced in the last decade or so of American politics should change how we think about what's most effective or what's most convincing politically for some of the climate policies that economists and others on the panel might support.
Well, I'll jump in just briefly. I mean, it is sort of what I touched on around the idea of talking about the immediate economic impact on individuals. But I'm also thinking about it a little bit further, because there's this idea apparently at the federal level that if you get rid of the words climate change and you defund anything having to do with climate, that the problem will go away. And so I want to respond and see if we can promote a response very directly to that, to say that, the hear no evil, see no evil approach is very un-American and detrimental to American interests. And I want to see if there's some political, will or political courage to take on very directly and make it a much more immediate set of issues for people in their day-to-day lives. And I think there are a number of ways to try to do that include this idea that you're now much more vulnerable to drought and flooding and hurricane and fire and this whole parade of horribles. And that if we don't confront it, that we're going to be in much worse shape than if we do. Whether that's viable or not, and whether that will have any traction remains to be seen. But that's some of the stuff that I'm thinking about.
Well, I could jump in and say, given all that we've seen in the past 2 or 3 weeks, where EPA's staff and budget has been slashed, NOAA's staff and budget have been slashed, we withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, we're challenging CAFE standards, trying to challenge in the Supreme Court again whether CO2 is like a dangerous pollutant that can be regulated under the Clean Air Act. I think given just the level of polarization, the trend that we've been seeing earlier was like talking about it from a environmental perspective, or here are the damages, here are the wildfires, the flooding risk. And that is not working in this sort of an environment. I think so we do need to be shifting from this emissions control regulatory sort of framework and narrative to more of a industrial policy narrative, which is what like President Biden was trying to do with his Inflation Reduction Act, saying like, oh, here are what $370 billion for upgrading the infrastructure, building back better. And I think that's where we need to be pushing, because there are a lot of like red states. Like climate change really is not like a one state problem. This is like really, and not even a one country problem. And so we do need to be incentivizing new strategies, new methods across numerous sectors, the energy sector, transportation sector, manufacturing. And I think all of the where we can get consensus is like, I think where we have like a lot of these funds like already authorized by Congress. I think just today, like there was a judge in Rhode Island who said that the Trump administration cannot, like, basically what they've done was like about half of the $380 billion that had been authorized under the Inflation Reduction Act had been actually awarded by January 19, 2025. The other half had not. And so President Trump had frozen like funding. I think there's like legalese, and you might know this better than me, Ken, on like, oh, how much is appropriated. So my layman's understanding is like, okay, they gave loans and grants of about half of that money and tried to freeze that. And today's district court ruling is saying that no, you're not allowed to do that. If it's already been like, if it's an obligation, you actually have to pay out that funding. And then the other half of it, I don't know if that's a separate case or what we can do about it, but a lot of that funding that has gone out to red states for things like, building out like wind power, solar power, transmission lines. And so that benefits them and creates jobs. And I think that's the marketing narrative that needs to happen, of also the benefits of environmental protection, not just in preventing fires in like liberal states, but like how the benefits to Trump's own voters.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can jump in too and say a few things. My impression is, just to maybe add a positive note, and of course, because what's going on is not particularly encouraging for those of us who care about the environment. But maybe a positive note is that when you think about green innovation and the green transition, the cost of solar energy in the last decade has dropped about 90%.
Mm-hmm.
The cost of wind energy has dropped about 50%. And so I think we're rapidly getting to a situation where, some of these renewable energies may actually become cheaper, and quite a bit cheaper than fossil fuel energy. And what's interesting about it is that some of the states that are leaders in renewable, like Texas, that is a leader in solar and in wind energy, is not only a red state, but it's also a state that has a lot of fossil fuels, as you know. But I feel there's here locally a lot of interest in green and renewable energy, because the business community views it as a profitable enterprise. And so it would be really nice to maybe get to a situation where, and now I'm sounding a bit like the techno-optimist, sometimes economists are techno-optimists, but it would be nice to get to a situation where, even in the absence of a very helpful government, that we can actually continue to make progress on that front. And so once there's enough economic interest in it, we may be able to shift the conversation back to creating and generating interest in green technology, independently even of whatever your views are on whether climate change is a disaster or whether it's a detail in the history of humanity.
Well, one way to talk about it, I think, is to say if we don't do that, then we're going to be at a major competitive disadvantage to China, India, and others. And it's really insane for us to be returning to a fossil-based economy when everybody else is going in a different direction.
Well, I think we also need to recognize the fact that we have been facing 30 years of disinformation on the part of the very powerful industry, which is the fossil fuel industry. And to think that rational evidence is sufficient in the face of an enormously wealthy and extremely powerful industry, and also a very reduced capacity of media to reach people with information, is a little delusional. And so even with the best economic incentives, I'm not so sure that that's enough. And in fact, what we are finding in California is that the utilities cannot make money on clean generation, and they're fighting further rooftop solar because it's not in their economic best interest. And so the question of, how cheap renewables are is a very interesting one because it has a lot of paradoxes in it. And if you're a utility and you're not making money on that resource, it's really hard to have a business model. So I'm kind of, it's much more complicated than I ever thought it would be, because I thought, well, renewables, but who controls them? Where are they put? Who gets rates of return? All of that becomes really, really important. So I guess I think that we need to be more sensitive to people's feelings and their understandings of things like fairness and well-being in order to make these kinds of arguments. They're not scientific arguments. They're arguments about how we want to live. And that's not a scientific argument. And we have missed that in the whole climate discussion, in my opinion.
I think that's a good place to end. I think we're at about the target time. I don't have any closing words of wisdom, but it's been nice to hear from all of you about your areas of expertise. And I hope that the students got something out of this. Sorry, we didn't do an explicit audience Q&A. The discussion was kind of free flowing, and we tried to incorporate some of the things written in the box into our discussion. But, I don't want to speak for others on the panel, but I personally would be happy if anyone wants to send me an email and talk more about any of the things we discussed on the panel.
That's fine, and thanks for being the moderator, Ishan. And thanks to the World Salon for inviting us.
Yeah, thanks for putting this together. It was really nice, and it was also good to meet all of you.
Yeah,
hopefully